we might as well use 19th century language in the, so none of you are old enough to have ever heard the word diminution before, but believe me, it's a real word. It's just gone well out of fashion. Most histories of cities focus on the city's growth, and most of them are presented in a kind of progressive way, that cities grow, suburbs develop along the fringes of cities, the cities then gobble up these new neighborhoods, and there's the kind of progressive that's meant in all that. Now, for someone like myself, who was born in York Township, in York Township schools most of his teaching career, I thought that it would be best if I turned that perspective on its head. And so what I want to do is look at how York Township diminished in size over 2 centuries. 50 or so incorporations, annexations, amalgamations, and a whole series of other kinds of political events. Now, as we'll see, most of these removals took place in the 3 decades of the 1880s, then there's a gap, the 1900s, then there's a gap, and then the 1920s. So to put it simply, rather than looking at how Toronto grew, we're going to look at how York Township shrank. Now, in 1793, John Graves Simcoe, as you know, decided to move capital of his new Upper Canada away from the border town of Niagara-on-the-Lake to a new town site at the mouth of the Don River on Lake Ontario. And what had been, for a couple of years, called the Home District, whatever that meant, then had to be divided up and surveyed into regular townships, of which York Township was the centerpiece. And so York Township was then born. Now I hope I get the right. Okay, do I have to point at it?
No, yours.
What?
There we go.
There's working.
There we go.
Okay. Simcoe has a map drawn that would show the original plan for the town of York, which is, oh, you see, it's not reading it. You must have magic fingers wherever you are, because I can't get it to work. Still not reading it.
Right.
There it is.
At the top of it. Like that. So
Oh, you went too far.
Yeah.
Okay, so move it back.
Right there. There you go.
Okay, so there's your original town site of the town of York. Where was I? So you'll notice that the town is actually don't want to know that. Over to about Jar and the rest of the township. I'm hitting the wrong thing. Come on. I need magic fingers. I don't have them. Why is it not working for me and it's working for you?
If you right here, you should click it right there. So just click it right there. So right now, there you go.
Okay,
I'll sit here. You tell me to go.
okay. I can't move it.
Oh,
I
yeah,
just
you can
hit.
move it, yeah.
Okay, so. Whoa. Now, the township was surveyed in a regular pattern from the lakefront, well, actually from Queen Street, which was then called Lot Street, which is the first concession, up 9 concessions on the border each part, up to Steele's, and then from the Humber River, of course, by Etobicoke Township, Vaughan Township, and Scarborough Township. Okay. And all the guy here, the Yorkshire, and you'll notice, of course, it is best could of York Township did not exist in 93. So I'm talking about the removals of areas from this rather substantial township over time. The first, of course, is the town of York, which I have in white, surrounded by that blue border. And from now on, the removals that I designate are all in white, surrounded by a blue border. You'll see them one after another. And so 3 years of that being established, a 10-block area plan, 1796-97, and the plan is to extend Toronto from the original 10 blocks over here over to York Street and then to Peter Street, and to move it up from the harbor all the way up Queen Street. And so this new town was the first large chunk of York Township to disappear from York Township and become attached to what was then the town of York. Okay. Here, named after the man who created this decision. Couldn't go any further because what you have in here, represented by these edges of the circular lines, is the ordinance area from Fort York. And you couldn't build within 100 yards or meters, I forget which, of Fort York, because of course your house would be bombed in their practices. So the plan was to take this Peter, and that was town expansion. Okay. Then by the time York becomes Toronto, it's expanded its boundaries again, past Bathurst Street, up to Bloor, and down the river, and some extent on the other side of the Don River. Okay. This plan, 2 years after Toronto, the city of Toronto was created, shows us a plan of the division of Peter McGill's land, which is from Queen to Gerrard and Yonge Street to Jarvis. Nice piece of property. And that was set aside for the building of the Ontario's first school until it became Ryerson University. In fact, that's Kerr Hall at Ryerson. From 1834 until 1860, you'll see there has been substantial development outside of the city of Toronto, just north of Bloor on either side of Yonge Street. You have some development here around Weston, the mills in Weston. You have a few crossroad communities up Yonge Street, and of course, a small community here in Lambton. So here we are at around 1867, Toronto, and the first post-Confederation exclusion, Yorkville, or sorry, no, pre-Confederation exclusion. Yorkville becomes a village in 1853. So these kinds of suburban developments are happening all over the place. It just happened that Yorkville was the first to create itself and excluded. Now, much of the development in the post-Confederation period was spurred by highway developments. Much of these developments were industrial, and industrially got the interest of the city in being able to gobble up those industrial sites, or not the sites, but taking control of those areas, because they were, of course, tax-rich areas. So by 1867, Toronto had added, just gobbling up suburban developments, an area that extended all the way to Dufferin Street and across the river, the Don River, all the way out to Kingston Road. To the beaches. Beginning for their way annexed in 1873, Park Estate. Meanwhile, suspension be Dufferin to incorporation of the village in 1876, and the rail of in 1878. Meanwhile, another railway-ish area, Weston, incorporated itself as a town in 1881. Another railway center, the town of West Toronto Junction, incorporated itself as a town, so we see it removed, along with the town of Toronto, way over on the eastern boundary down to the lake. And that was 1888. So by 1890, the junction was able to, remember, it's the town of the West Toronto Junction, okay? It's managed to annex large areas to the south of it, the Runnymede area and the area now known as Bloor West Village, and the hamlets of Davenport and Carleton on its northern boundaries. Then the town of North Toronto, I didn't catch it, establishes itself, secedes from York Township in 1890. So these are all incorporations of suburban communities. In addition to that, Toronto itself annexed a number of fringe communities. Riverdale, Leaside, and Norway, 3 separate communities that simply annexed in 1884 on the east side of the Don. The annex so-called, in 1887, and South Riverdale in 1880. I'm sorry, South Rosedale in 1887, and Seton Village, which had been established as a fringe community in the 1870s, the early 1870s, or earlier, finally got gobbled up by the city of Toronto in 1888. And then there was an economic downturn, a very deep depression in the 1890s, and that unleashed the same, sorry, I missed a line. And that depression, when it hit, ended this decade-long speculative boom that had built all of these communities along the fringe. And the whole mention of the city of Toronto or the creation of new communities just died. And it was simply over and the boundaries in York. In 1890s, depression of expansion created the first wave of annexation between both areas and the suburban areas along the fringe were one of those factors within York Township. It combined with Toronto's hunger for larger industrial tax base and led to a second burst of annexations. So between 1911, Township lost filled in these areas marked number 18, and a whole series of amalgamations of, some of them were on the other side of a street. Wait a minute. And then we start this process of Court, Earl's Court, the area of St. Clair. 1911, we have and then we fall into and this desire, this urgency to expand and take over now a little bit about especially number and other things that we get. Industrial commercial developments, significant tax revenues, and it does it at very little cost relatively speaking. That grow up found them in this era when people walked to work more than not. Both sides of commercial strips, Bloor Street in part of its area, the side, but also the schooling, sewer, all those kinds are heavy. Then right. So an old city say around it, right? Of the rooms and workers' families on meeting in Harwood in 19 Township had changed from being the largest organization in Upper Canada to being most people in Toronto. So for the next 40 years, or 39 years, there's no further change to the boundaries of this minuscule York Township. And York Township just chugs along, does its thing, and so on. Then, 1967, Metropolitan Toronto is formed, and the 13 component municipalities that were within Metro, well, actually Metro Toronto had been around for some time before that, sorry. But Metro Toronto, these get amalgamated and scrunched together to become 6 component cities and boroughs. And for the very first and only time, York Township grows. And Weston comes back into York Township 100 years, something of that sort. And I must say it was much to the chagrin of the people who still dispute the fact that York Township. In 1998, the 6 component parts of Metro Toronto amalgamated into the city of Toronto. And York Township and various mechanisms used. Mm-hmm. It may have been, in some cases, it was simply, it was as simple as the city of Toronto, for example, passing an annexation bylaw that said, we are now going to annex this piece of territory. So the people didn't from have York. Any say at all in that. And, well, they would have been, it would have been verified by some amendment to piece of legislation in like the City of Toronto Act or whatever its precursors were. Right. So it happened in different ways. Sometimes it was the city just said, pass it. When they got developed, I think in the 20s, or maybe earlier, when that whole area was developed, Canada Packers built and Swifts and so on, York Township would have fought tooth and nail to keep that tax base, and it lost it. And so, you know, there were different mechanisms that were used all the way along. And of course, with the disappearance You know, we voted, what, 79% against amalgamation? Didn't matter. It just got done. Okay. Sorry, we have the power, we're going to do it, and it happened.
Okay.
So I think that's the process that was often used. Yes?
I apologize if you mentioned it and I just missed it. What about York County?
Yes.
Where does that fit in now?
Oh, well, York County is, the mechanism that was set up for governing Upper Canada was that, and later Ontario, of course, was that there were several levels of government. There were local communities that could have been as small as villages, incorporated villages or towns and cities and so on, that were separate from the communities, the larger communities, mostly farming communities that built the roads and ran the local schools, which were the townships. And then the counties encompassed a number of townships and dealt with issues like the roads that would run through a number of townships, connecting one town to another town, to another town, to another town, and so on. And the counties would deal with some major works that would deal with the whole county rather, you know, a much broader area than the township. But most of the decisions were local, done by the township or by the school boards within the township or the towns or the villages and so on. And the counties, for example, every town in the county and every township in the county would have a reeve that would go and meet in the county town, and they would meet maybe once a month to deal with issues. Okay, so the issues that the county dealt with were very minimal. So if you take Etobicoke, York, Scarborough, Vaughan, King. No, I'm thinking of the townships and so on, and Gwillimbury, I guess, East Gwillimbury. And Stouffville, Whitchurch, Stouffville, right? Those were the townships, and they made up York County. But York County didn't deal with a lot of things. Actually, it was more significant as a judicial district than it was as a political district, because it was the county court in Newmarket that dealt with issues that outside of Toronto, which had its own court system. Okay? So, that's what the counties are. Yes?
There's a bit of history that you didn't mention that's very little known about York. Before what was the town of York used to be called Dublin.
I'm
You
sorry?
know that? It
Dublin.
used to be called Dublin.
The town of York.
It was called Dublin?
That's right. May I finish?
I've never heard that.
Well, I'm telling you, I can back it up too. So anyways, the town was largely Irish. Simcoe wanted to change the name to York, and his advisor says, "You're going to upset the Irish people. Hold on." So what he did, he called the harbor York, but Dublin remained Dublin. They've never ever changed the law, never. So it's still Dublin. What do you think of that? No, it's a fact. It's true. I like that.
I've never
Well, now you've heard it.
heard that story.
And make me prove it. I'm glad to do it.
Wow. Okay, I've been teaching the wrong things all
Oh, Toronto.
Thank you.
Now that you know that, like I said.
So the area just immediately north of Dublin became Corktown?
Well, subsequently, and you know, and Scarborough was Glasgow. No, Scarborough was Edinburgh. It was.
Yeah. But you have to keep in mind, we're talking about a time, for instance, I talked about how the surveyors created this regular pattern. You have to keep in mind, they did it despite the topography. When you think of it, it's kind of bizarre. But they drew these straight lines up through this impenetrable forest that they were going through. They drew these straight lines straight up and straight across. Concessions went across, east to west, and the side roads we call them in the country went north-south.
Mile
And
and
they
quarter
went
apart.
up cliffs, they went across creeks, it didn't matter, right? So if somebody comes along like Simcoe and decides that he doesn't like the name Dublin, he prefers the name York, he'd do that just because he could. And the surveyors would go out and draw these straight lines, right? Because they could. You know, if you go to some other cities that have the kind of topography difficulties that Toronto has, or even worse, you know, San Francisco, streets are all over the place, right? Because they make sense with the topography. Toronto, 2 kilometers from here to here, 2 kilometers from here to here, and so on. Why? Because they could.
Because the surveyors got there first.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's why we don't have a city of York or a York Township anymore. Because a whole bunch of people over 200 years decided they could. They had the power to take away what had been established in the first place. Okay? Yes?
Before you mentioned that at one point it was all councillors at large.
Yeah.
When it was across, did that ever change up to 67?
I'm sorry I didn't hear the end of it.
Did that ever change before 1967?
I don't know, Madeline, you know.
There were, each ward had its own councillor or 2 councillors and 1 or 2 trustees. There were 3 wards in York Township at one point, and each of them had 2 representatives. And then there was the Board of Control. And the controllers were elected across the township, and the Reeve was elected across the township.
When was that established?
I don't know when it was established, but I know that it continued to exist into
But it was
the,
certainly when the township was still a township before it became a borough.
yeah, I know that this was the way it was in 1920, and it continued. They rearranged the ward boundaries and established 8 wards with 1 representative for each ward based on population. And that was extant in the 1960s.
I don't know the date that switched over, but I do remember reading very recently a reference to in discussing that North York removal, that the farmers in York Township were really upset about having to elect their council at large. And so it must have taken place, I would guess, sometime after 1922, or maybe just before 1922, that a ward system was established. And there certainly would have been more. If there were a ward system in the old city of York, York Township, before North York went, and East York, there would have been more than 3. So when you're talking about 3 wards, you're talking about
3 was
from about 1928
when
on.
1920, when North York withdrew, and there was a vote in Mount Dennis as to whether they wanted to separate and become a municipality, and they voted no, they wanted to stay part of the township.
This was Mount Dennis?
Mount Dennis.
Yes.
And there was a commission in, I think it was 1928, the city wanted to amalgamate the southern part of what became Ward 8 or Ward 3, which was, they wanted to grab Bobby Point.
The Bobby Point.
Because it was high assessment. And the Commission of Local People voted that, on behalf of the people, they voted that if the city of Toronto wanted to absorb any more of York Township, they had to take all of it with the debt. And the city backed off, and then the province passed the York Township Act. And of course, York Township went bankrupt too.
When was that?
1923.
Yes.
You talked about what it took for the town of York to amalgamate, like to add on. What did it take for areas like Weston to break away?
Oh, they just applied, they applied, I presume, to the province. Because all municipalities are the children of the provinces. They would have applied to the province and say, we now have a community that's large enough and cohesive enough to run its own affairs, and therefore we seek to become incorporated. And the incorporation is not unlike a business incorporation, it just gets, done, it gets approved by somebody,
And so they did it kind of because they could. Yeah. Right?
so
So Weston, or for example, Weston did it kind of because they could, like the other time you were saying, the town of York took over places because they could, so.
But what they were doing was not unlike every other town and village in Ontario was doing at the same time. When they reached a certain critical mass that they run their own affairs and not be part of the township anymore, they often did that. Because there's certain advantages, there were real advantages to being a separate town with your own council, separate from the rural community, politically around it. You do different kinds of things. You go after industry, for example, and promote the town's industrial growth and its commercial growth, which you likely couldn't do if the council was being run by a bunch of farmers who had their own particular interests and weren't interested in that kind of industrial development because they raised their taxes and did nothing for them. So there was a kind of ongoing process that was going on there in not just in York Township. I mean, it's not unusual. Towns at the time from the 1850s onwards, all over the place, were becoming independent in a sense, incorporated. Yes?
Might there have been some industries outside of town boundaries that situated themselves there because taxes were lower, who would have resented being annexed by a city because of their tax revenue? And having to pay more taxes.
Yeah, I suspect that would have been the case for the last couple hundred years. I mean, that's to give you a very modern example of that, that's the Walmart solution to having to pay taxes.
Build right
You know,
outside.
Walmarts,
Yeah.
in most places, at least early on, were never downtown. They were always on the outskirts, and if you look carefully, they were just on the other side of the border of the town. Because their taxes in the township would have been less than their taxes inside the town. So I don't know whether Canada Packers established itself where it did because its tax base taxes would have been lower, but whatever happened, it sort of lost out because it got called up in any case.
Don, it was transportation,
Yes.
the railroad.
Sorry?
Transportation,
Yes.
the railroad.
Yeah.
That's
Why
what
can't it
numbers where a lot of the industry established itself where it was close to the railroad. And when they built the railroad, they often had, if they had an industry, they'd have a little spur off where they shut off the box cars to load up the goods. That was the story of Weston, you see.
That's right.
But I think that's proximity to the railroad was one of the big deciding factors. I don't know that they were so as much about taxes as they were about the transportation.
And towns everywhere fought really hard to get the railroad, which you never see anymore happening ever, like with auto companies last week. You know, it's just the same thing. But you could attract the railroad better if you were an organized, incorporated town than if you were simply a fringe community in a township that was sort of controlled by a bunch of farmers.
Yeah, the incorporated villages or cities could offer incentives to industry to locate there. And when the CPR was created, West Toronto offered them in exchange for moving their yards to West Toronto, all the free water they wanted, and railway underpasses for the rail, so that they would be unobstructed. And this was a tremendous free incentive. All the water in a steam society.
Yeah.
And the municipality of West Toronto Junction pumped it from the pumping station down by the lake, north. It provided water for the town as well, but mainly it was for the railroad, which brought in thousands of jobs in other industries in conjunction with it.
Yeah, it was why Parkdale became Parkdale as an independent village, because it was a railway center before West Toronto Junction. Same kind of process taking place, and they could do it more, they could attract business and they could attract railroad more successfully if they were an incorporated village or town than if, you know, that had that one focus, than if they were part of a much larger community that had a number of different competing focuses. The farmers in North York wouldn't want a lot of money and effort spent on trying to create railway centers like Weston. So, but when Weston became Weston, that's what its focus was. And so it was able to do that. So these incorporations took place for all kinds of economic reasons. And most of them were related to railway. One of the railway centers.
Now, I don't want to end discussion, but I think that this might be a nice opportunity to say, thank you very much. You know, I come from Weston, and I know this story, but not the big picture. I know the Weston story. And of course, you're quite right. We were dragged kicking and screaming into an amalgamation with York Township. But you get used to these things. So then it was even worse when we were dragged kicking and screaming as the city of York into the city of Toronto. And then, not only were we amalgamated, but later on we were dragged into it. Oh my God. I tell you, we've had a tough life ever since we started. But in any case, joking aside, you know, in our family we say that the worse the beginning, the better the ending. I think this is what our evening was this evening, because we had a few technical hitches, a little bit of difficulty, and I was getting to the stage and thinking, well, the show must go on regardless. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, Dawn. This is like a homecoming as far as I'm concerned. It just is great. Thank you very, very much. So we have something, the Humber River has played a large role in Weston and York Township, Mount Dennis, you know, this has been one of those seminal things. So here it is, the carrying place, which went up Weston Road for a portion of it. We probably have a cenotaph, a little plaque in Weston commemorating the carrying place trail, because we say that we are part of a long tradition. Anyway, thank you very much, sir. I think everybody.
Thank you for the opportunity to do this, and I want to thank the tech people. Where on the button do I hit this? So, next time I do this will be for the Western Historical Society.
No, but you know, we're thinking about this.
I'll talk about how the day that Weston gobbled up York Township. Thank you very much.
You know, somebody asked the question about the election and whether there are people from across the township elected or whether it's by ward. My son lives in Vancouver. So I didn't realize they still elect their councillors from across the entire city. So do you remember, Don, how many people you have to vote for? Paul in Vancouver? How many?
20,
How many councillors and how many school trustees?
30.
And he said just knowing the names of all of them, who the heck they were.
I think 31.
You have to elect 31 people.
That's still happening around here. Aurora is still,
Oh, really?
our town is not wards. Yeah, we elect right around the whole town.
Yeah.
We have 8.
It sounds bad here in Toronto, we get somebody for mayor and then
These are the actual number of people we have to elect. Can you imagine how many candidates?
Oh.
yes, because you've got that many, you've got big choices.
Thanks, Mr. Kendall. Really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed reworking it afterwards. I wrote the chapter 1987, I think we published, so that's 21 years.
Have you heard about, there's a project underway in the, have you heard of a project underway at the University of Toronto at the Matthew Library? They're trying, so Forte, one, I think, Jennifer, they work